Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. An important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. On July 13th, 2013, Warner Brothers released one of my favorite horror movies of all time, The Conjuring. I remember watching the trailers, and for the first time in a long time, being excited about a new horror movie. Lots of folks will disagree with me, but I think The Conjuring was influential, in part because it helped revive the horror genre. Sure, we had a few great movies scattered around, but I truly felt like the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s were a bit dull. Again, lots of folks will disagree, but I consider that era to be horror's dark ages. Anyway, for a few months leading into its release, I was thrilled at what seemed to be a genuinely scary movie, and I wasn't disappointed. Matched only by its direct sequel a few years later, The Conjuring lived up to the hype. And the best part is that it still holds up to this day. But what I didn't know at the time was that it was based on the real-life haunting of the Perron family. And because I love reading about the true stories behind horror movies, I quickly devoured articles, blogs, and books. I watched videos and documentaries, all to see how closely the movie matched the actual story. And as scary as the movie is, the real-life story of the Perron family haunting may actually be scarier. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're going to explore the Perron family haunting. Was their farmhouse really haunted by a host of spirits? What role did Ed and Lorraine Warren play in the case? And is there a more natural, rather than supernatural explanation? I'll share the story. You decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. In January 1971, the Perron family moved into an old, spacious farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. For Roger, Carolyn, and their 5 daughters, the 14-room home was idyllic and a dream come true. Built in the 18th century, the rather secluded home made it the perfect getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. Except strange things started happening almost immediately after they moved in. At first, the disturbances were small and subtle. A broom moved out of place or missing entirely, strange scraping noises against the kettle in the kitchen, and small piles of dirt on the freshly cleaned kitchen floor. At other times, the family heard doors opening and slamming on their own, cold spots moving through locked rooms, and the horrible stench of rotting flesh appearing and disappearing without reason. Soon enough, the Perron girls, Andrea age 13, Nancy age 11, Christine age 10, Cindy age 8, and April age 5, began noticing spirits throughout the house, shadow figures, a woman in gray, and perhaps most terrifying of all, strange figures watching them sleep at night. Of course, the haunting didn't start angry and aggressive, and in fact, one article described the early days as calm, stating, quote, "The Perrons encountered a number of gentler spirits within the old Arnold estate, Andrea Perron often described these early encounters as domestic, as if some spirits still thought they were living their everyday lives. End quote. I mentioned the family often found small piles of dirt on their freshly cleaned kitchen floor. The parents named this spirit the Sweeping Ghost, whose presence was made known by the soft sound of a broom brushing across the floor. Another spirit, known as Manny, quote, would quietly appear near doorways or hallways, watching the family with what Andrea called a sense of curiosity, not malice. Another spirit, believed to be a maternal figure, occasionally tucked the girls into bed or brushed their hair as they slept. End quote. At least initially, these ghostly encounters, while startling, were harmless, playful, and even comforting. But it didn't take long for the atmosphere in the home to turn dark, scary, and aggressive. And soon enough, the Perron family believed some of the spirits were angry and vengeful, and Carolyn Perron was their primary target. One article stated, quote, the playful whispers and light touches gave way to violent outbursts and oppressive dread. The Perrons reported that one unseen force began targeting Carolyn Perron, the mother. She would wake up with bruises, complain of stabbing sensations, and hear a voice warning her to get out. The spirit's fixation grew so intense that Andrea believed it wanted to possess the mother. End quote. Years after the family moved from the home, Andrea Perron wrote House of Darkness, House of Light, which detailed the family's experience with the spirits in their home. While researching, I purchased the first volume of the trilogy. In the section entitled Kiss of Death, Andrea Perron writes, quote, unaware several hours had passed, Carolyn stirred to a distinct vibration of footsteps crossing the wood of her bedroom floor. Sensing a presence behind her, presuming it to be one of the girls, she began to extricate herself from a heavy slumber, softly muttering, "What's the matter, honey?" Stretching her arm out toward the sound, knowing she could instantly identify the child by touch or by the whisper of a voice in the night, she found there was no response. Opening her eyes, pale dawn light revealed the grotesque figure of a woman hovering above her. Carolyn was staring directly into the torso of an apparition which had usurped the bureau beside the bed, standing in its place. The sudden rush of terror pulsed throughout her body, jolting the woman awake, sending one horrified soul scrambling for cover beneath a cotton quilt. End quote. A memoir that doubles as eyewitness testimony of the horrifying things the family was subjected to, Andrea Perron's books offer a startling view into Carolyn's fear as the violent entity terrorized her. We read about Carolyn's dread, terror, loss of concentration, concern for her family, and more. At some point, Carolyn recognized the house was centuries old and felt it was important to understand what they were dealing with. So she conducted research and learned the home had passed through 8 generations of a single family until she and Roger purchased it. And according to at least one article, she contacted a local historian who told her something else. The home had an alleged history of mysterious and horrifying deaths. According to one article, quote, several of the children had drowned in a nearby creek, one was murdered, and a few of them hanged themselves in the attic. End quote. Let's start from the beginning. What we now refer to as the Conjuring House was built by John Arnold, a wealthy businessman, in the mid-18th century, and was known then as the Old Arnold Estate. From the time it was built to when the Perrons bought the home in 1971, the Old Arnold Estate was passed through the generations of the Arnold family. Now here's where things get a little tricky, because while Carolyn Perron's research indicated over half dozen mysterious deaths, some of these might be more folklore than true story. First, it was alleged that a 93-year-old woman, Mrs. John Arnold, hanged herself in the barn. Second, it was alleged that 2 drownings occurred in a creek on the land. Third, it is alleged that multiple suicides occurred. Fourth, it is alleged that 4 men died of hypothermia somewhere on the land. Fifth, it is alleged that an 11-year-old girl, Prudence Arnold, was assaulted and murdered on the land. And sixth, there are stories of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman, an alleged witch, who not only dabbled in the occult, but also allegedly sacrificed her infant child before committing suicide. I say alleged because most of these stories cannot be verified by public records and have largely been passed down by word of mouth. Of course, it has to be said that a lack of public records doesn't make the stories untrue, just difficult to prove. So which stories are verifiable and which are not? The alleged suicide of Mrs. John Arnold cannot be verified as having ever occurred. Public records do exist for a woman named Susan Arnold, who did in fact hang herself. Except this occurred at her home, not at the old Arnold estate. Accidental drownings, death by hypothermia, and suicide were all documented in the area around the old Arnold estate. But no public records exist connecting these deaths to the land or the estate itself. And finally, a girl named Prudence Arnold was murdered in 1849. But public records verify the horrific tragedy occurred almost 10 miles from the old Arnold estate. At the risk of playing both sides, it's important to note that a farmhouse with as much history as the old Arnold estate has likely had more than a handful of tragic, even dark things that have happened over the centuries. And this doesn't speak to the land before John Arnold built a home on it. A quick side note, our home, which was built in the late 19th century, sits on land that was used in some way during the Revolutionary War. How do I know? Because the one-room schoolhouse that was built in the late 1700s is still standing less than a mile from my front door. And we believe our home is haunted by at least 2 spirits. And, finally, there's a small family graveyard less than 100 feet from our back door. I say all of that as a reminder that just because many of the alleged tragedies are either unverified or have been passed down like folklore, doesn't mean the Conjuring House isn't haunted. And if you notice, I didn't mention Bathsheba Sherman. In arguably the most famous of the alleged spirits haunting the Conjuring House, Bathsheba Sherman was immortalized by the Conjuring film, which depicted her as a murderous witch and a destructive entity who threatened the Perron family by possessing Carolyn. Except, when it comes to Bathsheba Sherman, what is true and what is movie magic? We'll continue right after this quick ad break. Bathsheba Sherman was in fact a real person who lived near the old Arnold estate. She was born Bathsheba Thayer in March 1812, and by all accounts had a relatively normal and uneventful childhood. In 1844, at the age of 32, she married Judson Sherman, a farmer, and together they lived on a farm about a mile from the old Arnold estate. And in fact, historical records do not list Bathsheba Sherman as ever being a resident at what is now known as the Conjuring House. So if she never lived there, how is she said to haunt the farmhouse and property? The answer may lie partly in truth and partly in folklore. And it's important to understand how the parents came to believe Bathsheba was involved in their haunting. In rural 19th century Rhode Island, families and neighbors often intermingled on each other's property. With the Sherman farm in proximity to the old Arnold estate, there is little doubt the families interacted often. And because the old Arnold estate was situated on a massive tract of land, where property lines were drawn, redrawn, or faded entirely, it's likely the Sherman farm may have been referenced interchangeably with the old Arnold estate. There's something else. infant mortality was high in the 1800s. According to one study, which you can find in the show notes, quote, white infant mortality circa 1850 to 1880 was in the range of 60 to 110 deaths per 1,000, end quote. These ratios, 6 to 11%, are significantly lower than previous data, which suggested infant mortality was as high as 30 to 40%. In some ways, these numbers seem low. But consider that in the United States in 2025, the infant mortality rate was approximately 5.47 out of 1,000, or just over 0.5%. Comparatively, 6 to 11% is astronomically high. That second part is important because it's the thing that pushes Bathsheba's narrative into dangerous territory. And it's also where her story moves from fact to folklore. According to legend, Bathsheba was considered beautiful and striking, a reality that for one reason or another, those in her community would use against her. Allegedly, one day while babysitting her neighbor's son, the young boy died. Doctors determined that the child's skull had been, quote, impaled with a small, albeit fatal tool, end quote. Bathsheba, despite being the last person to see the boy alive, was never charged, and the case was never brought to trial. And this enraged the women in her community. It's a terribly tragic and horrifying story, especially if you want to construct a certain narrative. I'll frame it as a question. What would you think if someone told you about a child who was mysteriously impaled while being babysat? Except, like so many other elements of Bathsheba's story, this is more folklore than fact. There are no court records, trial transcripts, complaints, or accusations about a child dying under her care. And it's a variation of the legend, because another version tells of Bathsheba's own child dying by her hand. It is believed Bathsheba Sherman had 4 children, but only one is believed to have survived to adulthood. Something interesting. The claim that she had 4 children is also not easily verified, as census records don't exist for that time period. That didn't stop the rumor mill. According to legend, Bathsheba killed one of her children out of devotion to Satan by driving a spike into its skull, and she followed that up by hanging herself from a tree and cursing the land as she died. And you guessed it, she did all of this on the old Arnold estate. Except, Bathsheba Sherman died in May 1885 at the age of 72. And she didn't die by suicide. She died of quote-unquote paralysis, which was most likely a stroke, and was subsequently buried in the Harrisville Cemetery. So where did the legend of Bathsheba Sherman come from? The lack of public records, newspaper articles, court transcripts, and other documentation force us to recognize the difficulties inherent within oral tradition. Maybe a helpful analogy. Have you ever played the game Telephone, where one person whispers a statement, in secret, to another, and then that person whispers it to the next, and so on? By the time the last person says the statement aloud, it's usually not even close to the original statement. Spot runs away can turn into the dog bit someone. Telephone, as silly as it is, can be a helpful reminder that oral tradition and folklore have its challenges, specifically in these areas. 1. Accuracy of the information received. In other words, did I hear this correctly? 2. Retention of the information received. In other words, did I remember what I heard? 3. Transmission of the information received. In other words, did I remember what I heard and share it accurately? And 4. Verification of the information received. In other words, can the information be cross-checked? In the case of Bathsheba Sherman, somewhere along the way, and possibly because someone in her community did not like her, the narrative became one of mysterious deaths, occult practice, devil worship, infanticide, and suicide, none of which are verifiable or true. Yet that hasn't stopped people from becoming convinced that she was a wicked, murderous witch whose torment extended past her natural life. Back to the Perrons. There's little doubt that Carolyn heard the legend, as she quickly became convinced that Bathsheba was behind the malevolent attacks. Initially, she woke up with bruises and heard verbal threats, but soon, these gave way to more violent attacks, being tossed across rooms, feeling hands tightly gripping her legs while she slept, and waking up with claw-like marks on her body. More than once, it was claimed that Carolyn levitated off the bed, howled in pain, and was tossed back down onto the mattress. And considering the legend surrounding Bathsheba Sherman's violent history, the Perrons believed she was responsible for Carolyn's torment. Desperate for relief, the Perrons reached out to renowned paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren, for guidance. Lorraine, a self-described clairvoyant, immediately sensed a hostile and malevolent presence in the home, and confirmed that it was Bathsheba Sherman. Something interesting. Clairvoyance is a compound word meaning clear seeing, and refers to a person who can see or perceive things beyond the normal senses. But clairvoyance is one of many types of psychic senses, which include clairaudience, the ability to hear things beyond the normal sense, claircognizance, the ability to know things beyond the normal sense, clairsentience, the ability to feel emotions beyond the normal sense, clairalience, the ability to smell beyond the normal sense, clairgustance, the ability to taste beyond the normal sense, clairtangency, the ability to touch beyond the normal sense, and clairkinesthesia, the ability to experience physical sensations beyond the normal sense. I'll cover the different clairs in an upcoming episode. In describing Lorraine Warren's experience at the Perrons' home, one article stated, quote, "She claimed the entity was inhuman, not just a ghost, and had claimed ownership over the land and the family." End quote. The Warrens, hoping to communicate with the spirits, organized a seance at the home. It didn't go according to plan. We'll continue right after this quick ad break. As they prepared to conduct the seance, Lorraine became convinced that the spirit targeting Carolyn was Bathsheba, as, quote, "She felt that she chose Carolyn specifically to intimidate or frighten her," end quote. This was especially evident during the seance, when Carolyn allegedly became possessed, began speaking in tongues, and growled and cursed. It was reported that while Carolyn was sitting in a chair, it rose with her off the ground and started shaking violently. And at least one article stated, quote, "Carolyn was thrown out of her chair violently," end quote. And another article stated the entity, speaking through Carolyn, declared, quote, "I am the mistress of this house," end quote. Hiding nearby, Andrea Perron secretly witnessed both the seance and the terrifying possession event, stating, quote, "I thought I was going to pass out. My mother began to speak in a language not of this world, in a voice not of her own. Her chair levitated, and she was thrown across the room," end quote. Another article stated, quote, "According to Andrea Perron, her mother's body contorted into a ball. Her mother's scream led Andrea to believe she had died. She claimed that her mother was possessed for several minutes and was slammed against the floor with her head. Her mother was temporarily unconscious before returning to her former self," end quote. Concerned for Carolyn's physical and mental well-being, Roger asked the Warrens to leave the home and stop their investigation. The Warrens returned one more time to check on Carolyn, but that was it. and the Perron family lived in the home until 1980, after which they moved out, and the haunting stopped. I mentioned earlier that Andrea Perron wrote a trilogy of books, House of Darkness, House of Light, Volumes 1, 2, and 3, which you can find links to in the show notes. To this day, she maintains that the haunting they experienced was real. For me, there's a real part of this story that feels anticlimactic, and I know exactly why. Because The Conjuring led us to believe it was more action-packed and demon-centered than it really was. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I know movies based on a true story take major liberties for the sake of entertainment. What I am saying, though, is that the Perron family haunting may not have made it to the public eye if not for The Conjuring. Of course, the true story brings up a slew of questions, and at least one sad realization. Let's start with the questions. First, what exactly was Ed and Lorraine Warren's role? As best I could find, their investigation into the Perron family haunting spanned several years and multiple trips to the home, and it culminated in the terrifying seance where Carolyn became possessed. Second, if the real story of Bathsheba Sherman does not involve the occult, witchcraft, infanticide, devil worship, curses, and suicide, how and why did Lorraine Warren claim it was her spirit haunting the family? I suspect we may never know the answer to why, but I also suspect the how has more to do with confirmation bias than clairvoyance. A number of articles stated Lorraine confirmed Carolyn's suspicion that Bathsheba's spirit was behind the haunting. Taking this at face value, Lorraine's assertion has nothing to do with psychic abilities, and everything to do with Carolyn's existing belief. It's like when my kids say something and then ask, "Right, Dad?" And I respond, "Yeah, sure." Now, I'm not discrediting the Perron family's experience. In fact, I believe they experienced something supernatural and terrifying. What I am questioning, though, is whether the Warrens' assessment of the situation and subsequent investigation was genuine. I mean, how could it be that Bathsheba Sherman was haunting the family and had placed a curse on the land because she was a witch, when none of that was true? And that leaves me with a sad realization, because for nearly 200 years, and especially the last 13 and a half since the release of The Conjuring, Bathsheba Sherman has been viewed and talked about terribly. By all accounts, she was an innocent woman who was not guilty of anything ascribed to her. Yet the prevailing narrative has been, and likely will be, that she was a murderous witch who killed her infant son, cursed the old Arnold estate, committed suicide, haunted the Perron family, and is still vengeful to this day. We've seen stories like this before. Women whose reputations were dragged through the mud, often leading to tragic results, to advance a scandalous narrative. Examples include Sarah Winchester, Maria Martin, and Bella and the Witch Elm. By all accounts, Bathsheba Sherman was a woman who did no harm to others, least of all children, who lived, experienced triumph and tragedy, and died at 72. And we should be content to let her rest in peace. As we close this episode of the Red Treehouse, we're left with this lingering question: who, or what, was responsible for the Perron family haunting? I've shared the story. Now you decide for yourself. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.